Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Toto Wolff has explained that he feels it is strange that Sergio Perez, proven multiple-time race winner, can get absolutely nowhere near Max Verstappen at this point in the season, adding fuel to the fire of those that believe that there's something not right about the equality between those two Red Bull cars. Is there any truth behind what Toto seems to be implying? Is there an innocent explanation for all of this? Very much into your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Quick update on Daniel Ricciardo. He actually had an operation surgery on his wrist, hands, as expected, and as he says in this Instagram post, hey everyone, surgery this morning, got my first bit of metal work, because that's cool enough, I guess. Big thanks to everyone who reached out to get my spirits up. This isn't a setback, just part of the comeback. Now, unfortunately for Ricciardo, it really is a bit of a setback, because if there's any time that Ricciardo would be in a prime position to prove that he's the man for Red Bull over Perez, now is that time, and he's going to miss at least a couple of races. Christian Horner has said that, usually the recovery for a normal person is going to be a couple of months, but with the best doctors, the best care, the best surgeons, and, being a Grand Prix driver, you can cut that down a little bit shorter. So we think that he's going to miss at least Monza, and that's what has been confirmed, that he's for sure not going to race this weekend, obviously, at the Italian Grand Prix, but 2 weeks after this weekend is Singapore. Gotta say for Singapore, that is one of the most physically grueling circuits on the calendar, so you can probably expect that he'll want to race, but if there's any race to come back to, Singapore's not an ideal one. Helmut Marko says that things are looking pretty bad for the next two races, and Singapore is only 1 weekend before Japan, so if Singapore's a question, then Japan is certainly a question, and after that there's only like 3 races to the end of the season, so it's not looking great for Ricciardo. It's now also been confirmed just a few minutes ago that Liam Lawson will be the man to replace Ricciardo for the next couple of races. They're not going to bring back Nick De Vries. I think there's a rule that teams can only use like 4 drivers throughout the season, so if they didn't want Lawson, their only option is De Vries based on the rules, I'm pretty sure, but obviously Lawson did a stellar job, so he'll be back again for the Italian Grand Prix, where Ferrari will be wearing these race suits which look like they've just turned up for their shift at McDonald's, but still, it's a tribute to Ferrari winning Le Mans earlier this year, but still I thought that was pretty entertaining, I guess. So anyway, Lawson's going to be in Monza, and quite possibly in Singapore as well, and if he does race at Suzuka, if really Ricciardo isn't ready even by then, he'll have some good experience around there, Lawson, because he's been racing out in Japan in Super Formula this past season. There was also this update before the weekend. I just wanted to mention that there was rumour going around that Alfa Romeo don't want to renew Zhou's contract. Quite possibly the money that he's bringing in isn't actually that substantial anymore, so they're considering alternatives, one of which is Drugovich, last year's F2 champion, and this year's potential F2 champion, Teo Pourchaire, had a bit of a shocking weekend again in Zandvoort, bidding it out of the race and not scoring any points in the sprint race either. So, yeah, definitely a potential switch round, which does contradict what we heard a couple of weeks ago, that Zhou was going to be safe. Now we're hearing Zhou isn't safe at all. So, potential changes in the driver market next year. But let's talk about the Zandvoort, the Dutch Grand Prix. Gotta say as well, this was set a record, this race, for not only the most overtakes in a Grand Prix, formerly held by China in 2016, but also the most overtakes in a single lap. On lap 3 of this race, there were 63 overtakes in a single lap, which is, look at this on the left-hand side, more than there's ever been. It's obvious the reasons why. Nobody knew what was going on with the tyres, apart from Red Bull, who made the correct decisions. Most other teams, Mercedes especially, as we discussed Hamilton's frustration with yesterday, McLaren and others made, some pretty major errors here. But it was a wild few laps, and to be fair, after that it calmed down a bit. I'd still give it a 4 stars out of 5, but it was a record-breaking race yesterday. Now, these were the overall race pace numbers. Very difficult, I'm sure, to calculate all this, because it was a complete mess, right? But after things started to get into the groove, lap like kind of 3, 4, 5 onwards, this is kind of what it looked like. So over the course of the Grand Prix, Verstappen was fastest, obviously, averaging a 77.34. Alonso was 3 tenths behind, and then the 2 Mercedes drivers. Now, Russell was in clean air a lot. Hamilton actually was in traffic a lot of the time, and even if you look at Hamilton's fastest lap of the Grand Prix, was actually pretty much on par with Alonso's, that's kind of the bottom bar here, right, in the quartiles. pretty much on par with what Verstappen and Alonso did. So Hamilton's perspective that he said after the race yesterday, that if he'd have had a better strategy and had been up there in the conversation, he would have been challenging for the win and certainly challenging for the podium. I think if they just pit Hamilton on when they should have done that first lap, he probably gets a podium yesterday. And he had some of the best pace on the entire field, and that is, you've got to consider, he was stuck behind Tsunoda a lot, he was stuck in a train a lot. When he was in clean air, that Mercedes and Hamilton were, and even Russell as well, were really competitive on the inters and on the slick tyres. So definitely a big what could have been for them. But if you look further back, you will find Sergio Perez behind Norris, behind Piastri, behind Ocon, behind Albon, technically ahead of Gasly somehow. I imagine due to them being on the same strategy early on, but I mean still, Perez 8/10 off Max, it's not looking good, is it? I mean, average race pace slower than all of these guys. He was 1.3 seconds off in quali, 8/10 off in race pace. It ain't looking so good. And this was the really damning part of the event, right? When, Verstappen was killing it, right? These conditions, tricky conditions, drying on the inters, he was really closing that gap on Perez. But at the same time that Perez was getting lapped 4 seconds a lap faster, Verstappen was behind him on that particular lap 7. Zhou was going faster than Perez. Gasly was going faster than Perez. And further back, Alonso, Hamilton, pretty much like the entire field was going faster than Perez at this point in the race. So, it's not just Verstappen being a monster in the wet, as he was. He was the fastest man on track at this point in the Grand Prix and was pushing hard and finding the limits, braking later, accelerating earlier, and just finding time in every corner. I was watching the delta between Perez and Verstappen and be like, how is Perez losing all of this time? It's falling away from him. It didn't make any sense. Verstappen was gaining over a second a sector for a part of this Grand Prix. And it's like, how is that even happening? His gap, obviously he got the preferential strategy. He was 14 seconds ahead of Verstappen after Verstappen came out of the pits on the lap after. He was 14 seconds ahead. That delta went down. He obviously made a mistake on lap 7 because he wasn't going that slow, but that was a particularly bad lap. And, went down from 14 to 4 seconds in the matter of about 6 or 7 laps. So not pretty for Perez at all. He even mentioned after the Grand Prix that he feels he deserved a podium for some reason, despite the fact that he was the one that, went off track when it started raining and lost the position to Perez, and if anything was very lucky to even survive, because he crashed into the wall, got his 5-second penalty that he feels like for some reason was undeserved, and, this is meant to be Max's challenger for the championship. It's like, come on. So as even Helmut Marko says, he crashed into the wall on the entrance, he got the 5-second penalty there. He was lucky again the race was stopped, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to save the 4th place. They needed to change the front wing, change the rear wing or something to even, keep his race alive. So an absolute shambles really. And people are wondering, yes, Max Verstappen always destroys his teammates, but, can it be to this extent with Sergio Perez, who is, he's a Grand Prix winner. He's not a great driver, but he's a solid enough, good driver, and he's proven that for many years. And as Toto Wolff said, this was after quali he said this, but it's still equally valid after the Grand Prix itself, to be honest. When you're 14 seconds ahead of your teammate behind you and you don't even get a podium, it ain't looking good. I mean, Checo is not an idiot, he says. Checo is a Grand Prix winner, a multiple Grand Prix winner, and he was already a winner at Racing Point before he joined Red Bull. So I cannot comprehend. I mean, okay, we've seen Max has destroyed every single teammate that's with him, whether that's his ability to create a car around himself that's very tricky to control, but if you can control it, then you make the gaps. But the 1.3 seconds in quali, I haven't heard any obvious explanations, but it's odd. You don't usually see a gap like that between teammates on the grid. There might be a few tenths in it between certain drivers, but, over a second, and of course on average it's not over a second, but, on average the race pace gap, especially race pace lately, let's just look at that, between Verstappen and Perez has been 5-6 tenths. Like, it's not something you typically expect. Now, I think it's very plausible that some of this gap comes from Verstappen being in pretty much untouchable form. Some of this gap comes from Perez being, I would say, lacking confidence right now, wanting to survive. He mentions that on that lap that he was really struggling on the inters, he was doing a bit of tyre saving because he thought the rain might return, despite the fact that every other team seemed to be pretty convinced that it was just going to keep drying up. So I don't know what that was about, but it seems like he was taking it really cautious, so I think that's probably part of the gap. But that can surely only explain so much, and maybe the rest of the gap is explained by Max really liking the way that car is designed, really liking how it handles, and Max and Checo, if anything, having somewhat opposite preferences on whether they like the car to be oversteery or understeery. But still, from the way things were going at the start of the season to how things have developed over the last few races, in addition to Red Bull making a pretty blatant decision to swap their drivers around by pitting Verstappen before Perez, despite the fact that Perez was leading and maybe should have been inclined to the optimal strategy at that point. But, you know, of course, they allow Verstappen to do the undercut, I think, to protect Perez's dignity, personally. But, you know, it's pretty obvious, I think, why they made that call, despite what Christian Horner might have to say on the matter. So, is there anything in that, right? Toto Wolff is saying it's odd. The obvious explanations don't make any sense. There might be something else going on. This aligns with the words of Charles Leclerc, has recently made similar comments where he said, well, you know, are you sure that this is legit, right? Is Perez really that much slower? It doesn't make sense to many of the drivers that can't understand why Perez is getting bodies. And look, I think that it's in part the way that Red Bull are, it's in part the Verstappen effect. And Red Bull will say, and Perez will say, no, the cars are the same, there's nothing to see here. And I think that's the more likely explanation. But yet there are still these, you know, conspiracies emerging, and you can understand it why this is the case, that the cars aren't the same, or there's something going on there. And people, you know, I know people have theorized that they're giving Perez a car that's deliberately worse just so that if the FIA find them out because they've made a, you know, cheating illegal car, that they can show them Perez's car. I don't really buy any of these theories, but you know, even when the likes of Toto Wolff and Charles Leclerc are both implying that there's something dodgy going on, it does make you at the very least wonder whether there's any truth behind some of these theories. So remember to tweet your thoughts in the comments below. But yeah, Verstappen is currently 138 points ahead of 138 points, sorry, ahead of Sergio Perez in second. Perez is still looking good to get P2 in the drivers, but Alonso, Hamilton are going to try and chase him down for sure. And Horner has said, no, he's going to be our driver for next year for sure. But Helmut Marko is still saying, this guy is lucky. You know, every time that we hear words from Helmut Marko, he's saying something different as to whether he's going to be a driver next year there or not. So, you know, I don't think it's guaranteed at all, but Daniel Ricciardo would really love right now to be putting in some good performances in races with a decent enough AlphaTauri this weekend, if they got the strategy right with Ricciardo if he was in the race. But, you know, they didn't with Tsunoda, that's for sure. So this weekend is the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, and the tricky thing is for Ferrari that they looked terrible this weekend. Sainz said they had the 6th fastest car. I don't necessarily disagree. Leclerc had an absolute nightmare, of course, both in qualifying. The car was understeery, the car was oversteery, a complete mess. But they go to Monza, and last year we heard all the rumours that they were going to turn up the engine to the max, even if it was going to explode. They were like, look, we're going to go all out for the win. And yet they still didn't get the win. It wasn't even particularly close, to be honest. I mean, Verstappen was always going to win that Grand Prix, and this is his chance to break Sebastian Vettel's record of Grand Prix wins in a row. Now, it will also be mentioned that there is something called the Monza curse for the last few years, where the driver who has won has then crashed out and DNF'd in, well, not necessarily crashed out in Ricciardo's case, but, well, retired from the Grand Prix in the following year. Charles Leclerc 2019, crashed out 2020, Gasly 2020, crashed out in 21, and then Ricciardo's car broke down last year after winning in 21. So, you know, maybe there's something to be said that Max is going to find a similar end somewhere, but, you know, more than likely he's going to win the Grand Prix and break the record, isn't he? But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I will see you next time.